Hi everyone, welcome to the Athletic Skills Podcast, and today I've got Isaac Hopkins back on me. So Isaac is a S&C coach across multiple areas, and I think it would be too long to say all his different roles that he does at the moment. So Isaac, thank you very much for joining me again.
Yeah, no problem. And yeah, you alluded to the fact that it is quite a few roles.
And we'll chat about the roles that you do at the moment and your journey, and then also we're going to go into a bit about Touch Rugby, which is one of the roles you do, which sounds quite an exciting opportunity at the moment. So Isaac, I normally ask people within these sort of episodes is why did you fall into strength and conditioning? So what makes you passionate around this sort of area?
Great question. I grew up playing quite a lot of sports, and probably the education that we now know wasn't quite delivered back when I was a youngster. And I ended up picking up like a small injury and obviously went through a little bit of like physiotherapy. And that's where sort of my interest into human anatomy and physiology sort of arose. And then I went through college, applied to do an undergrad in sports science, and I was always interested in doing physiotherapy. And it was only until sort of the back end of my second year, I sort of stumbled across what S&C was. I ended up getting an internship, and I guess the rest is history. Here I am.
So I know one story you like to talk to me about is how one email opened up many doors, opened up a door of opportunity. And I think it's quite an interesting way because we talk about, for students especially, how networking and reaching out to people that can really help people in terms of finding opportunities or placements and internships. So just want to talk through this kind of story, which kind of sets you up to where you are now.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the end of my second year, when I stumbled across S&C, I started to look into sort of masters and was sort of considering what my options were with only a year left in higher education. So I ended up emailing one of my S&C lecturers at the university, and I sent him a big email, which is basically along the lines of, I'm really interested in it. I've got absolutely no idea how I get into the industry. Can you point me in the direction of a couple of universities? So he sent me an email back and basically alluded to the fact that there were so many different universities that you could pick from, but that his colleague had gone to St. Mary's University in Twickenham. And did I want to have a conversation with him about the master's program there? So I took him up on the offer and again started chatting to the colleague. And again, we went down the rabbit hole of like, what's more important, experience, academic qualifications. And the next thing you know, he's put me in touch with his colleague who's an S&C coach at the university for shadowing experience. So in the space of one email, I've gone from trying to find out information about masters to sitting down and having a coffee with one of the lead S&C coaches at the university. And 2 weeks later, I was shadowing him with a load of the university students. And that really opened my eyes up into basically how I got into the industry and what it was all about. And then that sort of has sort of spiraled and snowballed into where I am today. And every role that I've gone through has always linked back to that one email.
I just want to talk about how you went around that first opportunity. So I speak to quite a few practitioners, and I might get messages off students or people want to get into the industry, and it might be a lot of give. Can I just come and see a session, or can I come and work for you? And that might not be the right way to go around things. So how did you go around approaching that first sort of message to reaching out to someone?
I was purely inquisitive at first because of the lack of probably knowledge and understanding about what S&C was. It was very much along the lines of, could we sit down and have a coffee? Can you talk to me about your experience as an S&C coach? And it was at the time as well where I was still trying to get physiotherapy experience, but because I didn't have any insurance and all of that, it became very difficult to sort of get hands-on experience in a clinic. So having this conversation with the S&C coach at the university, we started talking around about like philosophies, and I started talking about, I'd done a year's worth of sort of sports coaching just prior to it. And we were talking about sort of the carryover skills that you might have in terms of how you communicate with individuals, how you manage large groups of people, what it's like in difficult situations, working under pressure, those type of, day-to-day aspects that you might see. So we had that conversation, and it was very much along the lines of, well, can I watch you work in action? Like I'm happy just to stand there with a notepad and a pen and just write down some things. And he was more than willing for me to come along and watch him coach. And then that all of a sudden became what do you think of this? And he'd ask me questions based on things that I was seeing within a group setting. And it really just sparked my interest. And then I guess 4 months later, I was a student a student intern coaching between sort of 12 and 15 hours of sort of work experience a week, which is amazing.
And I think that questioning part that you mentioned really shows the person that you're working with, your interest, and your also, and I found it myself that you're as someone that has interns working with them, it kind of pushes you as a practitioner if you have people asking you about why you do things. So I think they appreciate that as well.
Mm.
So I think that's a great way to go around it as a person wants to get into the industry, asking as many questions as you can.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you always have to question why you're doing something. I see it all the time, and I was teaching last week, and I sort of basically our session was set up so that we'd give athletes an opportunity to create a simple S&C session with absolutely no background in whatsoever. And then we just asked them why they'd done it. And I think having that deeper motive as to why you do things, why you might choose scenario A over scenario B, why is problem C something that can later occur? And are you thinking, having that idea around why you do what you do is so important.
So now you've got this opportunity after the email and speaking to this person. What happened next? So how did that start to progress your career?
Yeah. So started off in the academic year of September, got all involved, threw myself into it, was working with ball, tennis, cricket, and hockey at the time. Those are the four sports that I was sort of overseeing and shadowing. And as the first term went by, sort of like my responsibilities grew. We'd sit down after our Monday sessions and we'd do 30 minutes of sort of like CPD based activities, whether it's simple things like designing a ramp warm up, how you might structure a gym session, stuff that's very basic for us now as S&C coaches. But actually for me back then was absolutely like, it was like gold dust. It's stuff that you're not taught in a lesson. So sat down, and as the term went by, I was getting more and more responsibilities, and it got to Christmas, and he pulled me to one side and he basically said that he was stepping away from his university role and he was going into another industry. So I was quite gutted because it sort of left me in the dark as to like, what happens now? Am I going to continue my shadowing? Because I'd grown such a passion for it over the 4 months. And after Christmas, the university had obviously were in the point of employing new people, and the other S&C coach was like, just keep coming along. Like, we can give you here. Is it all right if you potentially just deliver this session? It's everything programmed. So all you've got to do is go through the warm up stuff that I've been doing anyway. Sit down. I'll be there with you. And obviously you can take on more responsibilities. And I grew in confidence as a coach, and I took on a little bit more responsibility, and that ended up turning into sort of a paid part-time role. Now, I was very fortunate that the individual that had come into the university was also very accepting as to where I was in my career, and they were sort of very willing for me to crack on and do what I've been doing. And I grew a really good bond with a lot of the squads that I was working with. It also turned out then on the side that one of the county cricket clubs that's very close to us was obviously then looking for a pathway coach at the time. And one of the university S&C coaches has also done previous work for them, and they'd got in contact with him. Now, he basically put two of us forward for the role. And 4 years later, I'm still in that role. So that original email that I sent that got me into shadowing also got me into my first role. And it was, I don't like to use the word right place, right time, but over the sort of course of the few months that I'd been shadowing and developed and honed those really nuances to S&C. I then started to work in academy cricket, and like I said, sort of 4 years later, and I'm still working there.
Now, I imagine the story isn't all smooth sailing in terms of how it went. I'm sure there were a few challenges along the way, whether that's when you were shadowing and actually as a coach or a practitioner, or outside of your coaching, there are a few challenges along the way. So, what were the main challenges especially when you're trying to balance across multiple sports and alongside other stuff you're doing as well? So, yeah, what were the main challenges along that journey?
I think the biggest one for me is I got into the S&C world and thought I could coach everyone and everything. And whether that was sort of naive of me to think, but I ended up coaching the high performance squads at the university. But I also decided that the third, fourth, fifths, and sixths of the university setup also wanted coaching, but they couldn't get access to a gym, so they gave us access to the tennis courts. Now, I took the environment and the lessons that I learned in one place and tried to apply them instantly to another, and found out very quickly that actually they didn't work. And I learned a huge amount within the space of a couple of months that I was coaching there, that you couldn't just take every single lesson and apply it to every single scenario. And that was a massive learning curve for me, because what I thought I instantly knew turned out that what worked in one place didn't work in another. And as coaches, I think we're always exploring that in new realms, that previous lessons don't always apply to certain scenarios.
And I think actually, well, you mentioned there actually trying things and being open to making mistakes is a big thing that in terms of in developing your career, you could have easily just took a step back. You could have not actually took the leap and actually gone into those sessions. So actually trying new things and be willing to make mistakes is kind of a big part of your development.
Yeah, absolutely. I think looking back in hindsight now, what they believed to be their gym fitness based sessions wasn't things that potentially I would have done. And obviously I came in and tried to rewrite the script very early on. And instead of now knowing what I know, being that try and build rapport with individuals, try and build rapport and education, it was quite literally a session one, we're going to do this. It's completely different to what you've done before. And it didn't work. And instead of then being reflective in my own practice and going, okay, they want X, I'm at Z, and we meet at Y, I was adamant that Z was the right answer. They were adamant that X, and there was a breakdown in that sort of trust and rapport that probably both sides of the parties didn't quite click straight away. So I learned a huge amount from that. But it also comes into what I learned at the university, and those high performing athletes there, you couldn't apply to the academy cricket sphere as well. Because a lot of those athletes were new into a gym. They hadn't had that exposure. They didn't have that movement competency or that movement literacy. And thus, you couldn't again apply those lessons from a university setup into a junior youth-based setup either.
And you mentioned there around how training might not be able to transfer across different settings. And does that come from being open to opportunities in multiple sports? You get many practitioners that maybe want to work just in football or just in cricket or just in rugby and stay in one setting. But as yourself, you've had opportunities to coach in lots of different sports with different types of athletes. Has that made you a bit more adaptable then as a coach?
It's probably hard to say whether I'm more adaptable than other individuals. I think for me, I've had quite a lot of exposure across quite a lot of different sports, and many of the sports that I've worked in are a variety of team-based, individual-based, court-based, pitch-based. So there's lessons that you can learn from all of them, but I also think that sort of encounter lots of different types of personality traits, lots of different individuals within that. And for me, it's probably the softer side, the softer skills that I learn a lot from. I think taking those and then being able to be more adaptable with different types of individuals, whether that's an athlete, whether that's a head coach, whether that's backroom staff, has probably made me slightly more aware. I'd say almost hyper aware of those things. And sometimes that can also be a negative, but it's probably made me more aware of those softer sides of individuals and how you can try and get the best out of everybody, but not by treating everybody exactly the same. In terms of some people like, more of an arm around the shoulder. Some people like more of a, you're slipping in your standards here, like, come on. And that for me has also been the big thing as well. It's working with, different age groups from 12, 13 years old all the way up until, seniors and adults now. So you learn a huge amount from that.
Now, I know one of your roles is working within the school, and also you've had experience obviously working within sports. So I can see recently over the last few years that kind of the S&C industry has grown within the school environment. So what are the differences in terms of coaching within a school setting compared to a sports setting?
Yeah, good question. I think first and foremost, going back to lessons, I came out of a university setup that lots of these athletes were at a level where they were competing internationally at age group based, whether that's under 23s, under 21s, some of which were in developmental pathways for Team GB, other European countries. So I came out of that with an idea that I thought everybody wanted to be involved in S&C. I thought that everybody would be there, and stepping foot into a school that previously had no athletic development, sports performance department before, I was shocked at the difference in mindset. And it was a big challenge for me. And it was probably, I don't think it was till maybe a year into the role that I then started to get consistent numbers, consistent messages being put across from different members of staff, different sports coaches, that actually this is really important. I think the biggest thing, again, I have to sometimes take a step back and go, it's still a school. It's still an academic, educational based industry. How much that they can squat relative to their body weight doesn't make a difference. And thus the priorities of individuals change, that sometimes we might have clashes with when our S&C session might be, and there might be medicine society for those senior sports individuals that want to go study medicine or STEM-based subjects at a university. And I think you have to then be able to manage that and cope with that sometimes it is inconsistent. And how can you then adapt with that?
And I've worked a little bit at school as well, and one of the big eye openers for me was you've got to try and get people's buy-in for people that don't want to be there, that don't have an interest within fitness or sport as well. Because when you work within sport, you take for granted that people have a natural interest in performance and they want to get better. But when you work within a school, not everyone may think like that, especially. So you got to try and fit individuals who do have an interest within strength and conditioning or within sport, and also those that may not have even an interest within fitness, and you've got to try and get everyone's interest and buy-in at the same time.
Yeah, naturally, I think there's still a lack of understanding as to what strength and conditioning, athletic development is within the school place. And this probably leads on to a project that myself and the director of sport have been building towards this year, that certain people don't quite understand what we're trying to achieve. Some people just think that you're there to sit in a gym scenario and you let other people just work out. And actually, it's those conversations that you have and they sort of go, oh, I didn't realize that. And I'm still having those, 3 years into the role now, that I'll be chatting to somebody about something and they'll be like, oh, I didn't know that. But for me or for other school coaches or even just S&C coaches, that's normal. But academic staff have got their own priorities, their own worries about teaching. So their understanding about what our roles are as S&C athletic development coaches is limited. So I think buying culturally is one of the most important things. It's probably the biggest seed that you can plant early on is what you're trying to achieve and why you're trying to achieve it. And we're trying to foster an environment that isn't just purely sports performance based and trying to look after those top elite performers that we've got. We're also just actively trying to get people engaged more in health and fitness and a healthy lifestyle.
So one last question around this topic is, and I know you're currently doing your PhD at the moment, which again will be taking up a lot of your time. So, as a practitioner, how do you balance the research side and also putting that into practice within the context? So, how do you maybe look to put the kind of the gold standard or the textbook into your context?
Yeah, great question. I think as coaches, we're naturally inquisitive anyway. I think a lot of our role is asking ourselves why, and then sort of using hindsight is trying to work out why it's important, how we might test for that. So naturally, many of us are probably quite science-based anyway. And I think for me, it naturally became an evolution of my interest in cricket and then my interest in maximizing sort of scoring runs as a batting perspective. And it evolved into a project whereby I just started to do some research on it, and it led into, this is quite an interesting area. And then it became I've always sort of considered a, professional doctorate or a PhD. And I think that the way the industry is at the moment, I think more and more people are starting to move towards S&C and PhDs because it shows a different nuance of skills that maybe you might not get in the gym sphere, whether that be the ability to work with large data sets, collect research, looking at long-term vision plans and apply that via research. So for me, balancing it is a interesting one because my PhD is very applied anyway. So a lot of what we do on the day-to-day, whether that be profiling and monitoring athletes, sort of reincorporates back into the research side of stuff. And again, because we're all inquisitive, I'm reading papers all the time on different areas of interest, different areas of sports that I might want a little bit more background knowledge in before I start programming stuff, really. I think the balance part is quite nice. I think if I'm starting to do a PhD in a topic area that wasn't related to S&C, I think there would be far stricter boundaries on where I'm at in terms of what I can manage workload wise.
And we'll have to get you back on when your PhD's coming to an end and you can tell us all about it and what you found.
You got a while yet.
So before we go into Touch Rugby, I know you're one of our mentors on the Pro Sport Mentoring course. So with that, you're working with some students in terms of wanting to get within the sporting industry or across any different parts of high performance sport. So thinking back on your career and your journey, what's one piece of advice you would give to a student now who's wanting to get into the industry?
Probably two. One is just get coaching. Coach anything and everything that you can, because you can't take everything from a textbook and instantly think that you'll be an amazing S&C coach. It's far more than just applied research. And the other thing is probably be reflective. Now, I was very fortunate that very early on, I had probably 2 or 3 mentors that were really supportive of my journey, many of whom I'm still in contact with. And they probably provided me a different mindset, a different sort of outlook on what I was trying to achieve. whether that's through reflective practice, whether that is more so questioning why I do what I do. And those skills for me have probably been the two biggest things of getting experience coaching in different environments, different individuals, youth, senior, general population, but also then not just finishing a session, shaking hands and leaving, sitting down for 5 minutes and going, what worked really well? What could I have improved on there? This scenario that arose in the last 45 minutes to an hour of a session, how do I deal with it? Why did I choose that? Would I have changed anything with my own way I explained things, how I demonstrated stuff, when I interacted with individuals, when I should have just stepped away? Difficult in the youth sphere, but sometimes just sticking your phone or recording device in the corner of a room while you're coaching and watching yourself from a third person's perspective afterwards is quite an interesting one, because you'll start to see other things that you might not notice, which is body language and those type of aspects as well.
Yeah, and it's something that I really hated doing that. And from that though, I realized, like you mentioned, I was stood maybe always one side of the gym.
Mm.
Then after that session, I then started to move around. You start to see a lot more in terms of what's going on, and also use certain phrases that you don't realize that you maybe use when you're
Mm.
coaching, like "Hey guys" or something around those. That it kind of puts into perspective what the athletes hear from you.
Yeah, definitely. I think people don't pick up on those blind spots so much until they actually are confronted with them. And I'll always do it now with interns that I've got, is I'll just let them make what I will call scheduled mistakes, things that I can see them doing that I know are going to cause not injury or harm, but that might sort of confuse them, sort of like muddle them up within the next couple of sentences, and then sort of have a conversation with them afterwards. And they start to pick up on stuff. And it's that type of thing of allowing people to coach and giving people responsibility, but confound within the train tracks, guided learning, if we'll call it that.
Now, I just want to go into about England Touch. So a few episodes ago, we had Dom, who is one of your players and coaches. So just want to explain your role in terms of an S&C coach at England Touch and what kind of that entails. I know it's not day to day, but what kind of entails within your role.
Yeah, touch is an interesting one because it's a massively growing sport at the moment. And there's, because of the non-contact element of it, there is elements of contact, but maybe not the same as your other rugby counterparts like union or league. There's more of an emphasis on robustness and the way that tournaments and games are scheduled, as opposed to general contact, mass times momentum type of elements as well. So the S&C coach role there is very much around, yes, there's definitely an element on performance and speed, change of direction, upper body physical qualities, but also there's a big emphasis on robustness and sort of physical capacity work as well, being able to handle essentially the World Cup in 2024 in Nottingham with 6-7 days of 2, 3, 4 games a day potentially. And that's a lot of minutes on feet. That's a lot of high speed running. That's a lot of accel, decel, change of direction, agility based work that if your body and your physical capacity can't handle the demands, there's going to be a massive emphasis 2, 3, 4 days later on what you can and can't do as an individual. So for me, the S&C coach's role there is predominantly around that type of capacity and handling demands as a player, and then building foundations that we can then start to explore space, take space, make space as an individual.
And you mentioned there how intense blocks that you do, especially, well, the competition, but also I know you do training camps where you try and fit as much as you can within a couple of days. So how do you maybe start to structure those couple of days, let's say a camp, to get the most out of it in terms of your physical stuff that you want to do and maybe the technical coaches want what they want to do, and how do you go around balancing so you get everything that you want out of those 2 days?
Maximizing time is definitely the big thing. I think coming off the back of the World Cup and the natural, probably subconscious pressure that was applied to that, because it was on home soil, there was a lot of emphasis on being technically sound, wanting to maximize our technical tactical ability, because we're playing teams naturally from southern hemispheres that we might not have played against for 2, 3, 4 years, and a lot can change in that time. So coming out of the 2024 World Cup and into now this new season, there's going to be hopefully more emphasis on balanced time around the ability to apply more S&C based closed skills that we can then change on the acquisition scale to be simply more open in exposure, that they can take from the elements of the game and refine those skills, whether that is the ability to accelerate, make a touch, and decelerate, breaking that down into, can we decelerate well? Can we decelerate and then backpedal well? Can we cross over and square our hips up laterally efficiently so that defensively that you can stay nice and tight as well? So there's elements to that that I'm exploring in that type of realm as well.
And what's it like? I know it's an international, you work with an international environment, but primarily amateur sport or amateur athletes. So how do you go around maybe educating these athletes to develop stuff in their own time when they're away from you, to making sure they are ready to come into camp or for the World Cup that you mentioned and actually be physically prepared, even though you're maybe not with them in person?
I think education is always a constant battle in any sport, especially sports that are predominantly more amateur based, because you don't see them very regularly, or the foundations within the lower levels of the game aren't as established as maybe other sports. So a big thing for that, pardon me, a big thing for that is giving them access to a variety of different recovery modalities, whether that's sports massage, whether that's cold water immersion, whether it's active recovery, whether it's the ability just to have 30 minutes in the middle of the day to go back, have a nap potentially do some, static stretching work, active recovery, as I said. And it's giving athletes their own chance there. Now, a big thing for us was not allowing athletes to try new things in the World Cup. And a big thing for that was giving them pre-exposure World Cup to sort of know what works for them, what doesn't. I think for us, the education is always something that we're working on. And I think that stems from coaches as well, and having sort of refined messages that are consistent across the whole program, and not one individual saying one thing and one individual saying the other. Is we're trying to be collaborative in our own messaging across all the high performance programs, but also allowing it to then step into the regional game, step into the club game, step into the junior setup as well.
I know, having watched a couple of games of touch, I know how demanding and high intense the game can be. So what are the key demands of the sport in terms of, you mentioned the ability to accel well, the ability to decel, change direction. So are really those high intensity actions the most important parts on the pitch that you want to focus on within your training environment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the game itself is a mixed method of modalities, that there is certainly a lot of low level rest. You're talking roughly sort of 50% on, 50% off because of the rolling subs category. But there's also a lot of running involved. There's also a lot of chaotic demands when it comes to stuff like agility, because of the unplanned nature of the sport, and because you're confounded by the amount of touches that you have. There's a real emphasis on trying to gain territory and almost move opposition back, so that they're further away from their own try line. So there's definitely a big emphasis on running, both laterally, forwards and backwards. There's also some emphasis on high-speed running. And because of the touch element and the fact that you have to gain 7 to be onside, it can then allow good opposition and good players the ability to expose individuals, and then due to them being offside, then exploit gaps, and then obviously increase their high speed running. Because of the limited numbers, and sometimes players are forced to try and, I'm almost going to say, throw a big long miracle pass. There is elements of interceptions. I think a big thing that we're learning as S&C is that there's a huge emphasis on deceleration ability, the ability to accelerate, to stop opposition making gain line territory, make a touch, and then retreat as quick as possible to then get back into a defensive structure and be onside, so you're in play. So there's a huge emphasis on that deceleration and backpedaling ability, which has huge demands on obviously that eccentric capability, that breaking force potential as well.
And just to mention around deceleration, I often think that's a forgotten element in terms of speed development. We always think sprinting is about those high speed actions, whereas deceleration, if you can't control how quick you're going and be able to change direction, or whether to be able to stop and backpedal, as you mentioned, then that's probably just as important.
Yeah, definitely. I think I'll use a lot of analogies when I coach speed, and I think braking and deceleration is almost like giving car brakes. Now, as a S&C coach, we can try and make you as fast as possible to your own potential, but if you build a supercar to make it as fast as possible, the moment you get to a corner or a bend and you haven't got any brakes, there's only one thing that's going to happen. So deceleration within the research field is obviously being explored massively right now. And I think there's lots of really interesting research coming out around the huge demands on the body for deceleration, but also the fact that players need to be able to put themselves in positions from a biomechanics standpoint that they can then be efficient moving from. Because being able to stop is one thing, but being able to stop and then be able to backpedal as efficient as possible to make that defensive line is another element of a skill that you can break down from an open to closed scenario as an S&C coach. Try and train both in the gym, on pitch, and so on by a multitude of exposures. And then apply that back into a defensive drill that a technical coach might be looking at. And allow the coach to then have a game plan that works.
So you mentioned how touch is quite a progressing game in terms of how it's been in the past, and then it's growing each year. So where do you see the game going in terms of the physical standpoint? And is that going to change in terms of your role and what you're focusing on?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think watching some of these Southern Hemisphere teams at the World Cup, now we spoke a lot about them prior from what their potential is in terms of how fast they play the game. I think the most fascinating thing for me is how quickly they make decisions. And obviously the quicker they make decisions, it makes them look faster. So there's a big emphasis on decision making and opportunities. I think the other thing there as well is providing our players with a really developed palette of different athletic qualities that they can then cope with different types of scenarios, whether that it is the ability to explore high-speed running, whether it is the ability to handle a multitude of decelerations across multiple games, across multiple days, so that defensively their physical capabilities aren't questioned. If it's a decision that they make, then so be it. But I think for me, the big thing around that is developing players that can handle physical demands to play against some of these really fast-paced teams.
Now, I know you've just created another project to go alongside your current work around your own business, around Touch Rugby. Do you just want to explain a little bit more around that and what you're looking to develop within that?
Yeah, it was an idea that I had probably just over 12 months ago now, around performance for and athletic development, S&C, performance consultancy work within the Touch Rugby sphere. And going into the World Cup in June, July of last year was interesting because seeing different countries and how they warmed up, how they structured their training, what they were trying to do throughout the day, throughout the tournament, even talking to some different individuals from different countries on how well they prepared physically. It was interesting that the responses were pretty mixed, and actually there was a big element on we hadn't really done much. They had done what they thought was adequate, but as we explore the game more from a S&C and research side of stuff, there's probably elements that maybe they hadn't considered or aren't aware of. So starting January of this year, I opened Train Touch, which is a performance-based company for Touch Rugby exclusively, that hopefully will provide training plans for athletes that can develop their own game from the sports performance side, whether that's through position-specific training, whether that's bespoke to an individual, whether that's a masters-based program for the older athletes, whether that is even individuals that have never stepped foot in the gym before and they'd want a basics program of home-based workouts, gym-based workouts. For me, the game of touch is growing exponentially and has probably in the last year to 18 months and will continue to do so, probably all the way up until the next World Cup, then obviously then 2032 potentially. So for me, it was not only developing homegrown players, and we have our own way with England, but also giving that opportunity to other countries as well.
And then where can people find that if people want to see what you're kind of showing?
Yeah, so at the moment we are based on Instagram at Train Touch. We've got a variety of different content, whether that's gym-based sessions. We put out some content yesterday, so third week of January, being around the needs analysis and how we might look at that from a physical standpoint. So sort of how many meters that they'd run, high speed running, the intensity that they play across the different genders and the different categories. And then going forward, hopefully going to provide more information around different positions, different types of regional versus international versus club standard, so that players start to understand the standpoint of where they are, where they might want to go, the difference in ability, the difference in quality. So there's a variety of different content. You can reach out to us on there through the DMs. Hopefully got some exciting projects that we'll build upon now over the next few months as well for training programs and bespoke coaching.
I know you're a busy person as well. So is there anything else that you've got coming up in terms of, you got any speaking events or anything else going on?
Yeah, a couple of conferences coming up. So we've got at the end of February, start of March, we've got the England Touch High Performance Conference in London. I'll be speaking there. I'm also delivering a workshop online on the 3rd of February for coaches there, which is on S&C and Touch Rugby. If that's something that they wanted to dive into, you can find all that information at England Touch Coaching. In terms of athletic development in the school sphere, March 15th in Exeter School, we are delivering a workshop alongside a retail performance on how to best implement athletic development within the PE and games curriculum as well. And we'll be exploring a load of different options, lessons that we've learned, how we might combat it, and sharing best practice as well.
Yes. And I'm sure that anyone's listened or watched this is quite a nice way to go into those conferences as well, in terms of you'll expand on some of the points that you mentioned there.
Absolutely. If any questions or you want to get in contact, please reach out on either my Twitter handle or LinkedIn. That's probably the best way to contact me.
Great. And I'll put those in the show notes as well for people that want to see. But Isaac, thank you very much for having you on for the second part. And I'm sure we'll have you on again at some point and chat about one of your another project that you're up to. And
yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Isaac.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Athletic Skills Podcast. I hope you enjoyed our discussion and found it helpful in learning more about impacting your youth athletes' movement and physical development. If you did enjoy this episode, please take a moment to give us a subscribe and share to any other coaches or teachers that you think it may help. Also, if you have any feedback or topics that you'd like us to cover in future episodes, please feel free to reach out to us on social media or on the email in the description, and we'll be more than happy to try and tackle those challenges you are facing as a sports coach or a PE teacher. Thank you very much, guys, for listening. I look forward to speaking to you soon.